Say what you want about Candace Owens, she's nothing if not persistent. This morning, she tweeted, quote, "I don't know if I was being fearless or if everyone else was just being a coward, but I'm glad to see everyone else wake up to the truth. The media has never been able to bully me into submission. The numbers never made any sense. I just more of a spine than most." She's referring to the revelation that the United States is counting coronavirus deaths differently than other countries. Dr. Deborah Birx said at one of the press conferences on coronavirus that if someone dies with COVID-19, that we're counting that as a COVID-19 death. So is Candace Owens right? Has she been fearless, or has everyone else been a coward? Have her predictions panned out? We'll take a look at that in a second and understand whether or not she's been responsible or rather totally flippant about coronavirus. But first, subscribe to Human Events, please. If you are new here, we have just set up a new YouTube channel. We're putting out daily videos. We're trying to get you the best content there is. Very rigorous, detailed analysis. So if you like what you're seeing, hit that subscribe button. It will help us out a lot. Now, at Human Events, we have published an article on this subject that has a somewhat aggressive title, "Candace Owens Should Stop Being Flippant About Coronavirus" by Gavin Wax. That goes into detail about a particular exchange Mr. Wax had with Candace Owens about whether or not caring about coronavirus and the elderly dying is the precursor to socialism. But we'll step back from that for a second. Let's go back and talk about whether or not Candace Owens is right about the fact that she's the one being fearless or everybody else is being a coward for thinking that coronavirus is serious and killing a lot of people. It's kind of, let's first remember, who is she quote tweeting here? She's quote tweeting Bill Mitchell, who's applauds her for being a strong voice in calling out the COVID-19 death rating scam. Bill Mitchell, of course, who, when he's not shilling for Trump, is saying things like, "While death is sad for the living left behind, for the dying it is merely a passage out of this physical body to a spiritual existence, free of this mortal coil. If one turns off the radio, the music is still there. For all we know, the dead wheat for us." That's about coronavirus. That's after his original statements about how ridiculous it was that we were doing anything about coronavirus look bad in retrospect. And Candace is not above these sort of predictions that are just turn out to be blatantly wrong in retrospect. But more to the point, like, who is she actually calling a coward? I think that at this point, it's safe to say that includes the President of the United States. Here's what President Trump had to say about the matter.
In fact, they specifically didn't want to do this. Have patients that were affected with this horrible disease or whatever, the plague, because frankly, it's a plague. That's exactly what it is. You'd read about it in the old days, the plague, and that's exactly what it is.
Let's look at some of Candace's other predictions. For example, back on March 10th, she said boldly, "One day we will look back and study the impact of the coronavirus. Not the virus itself, of course, but the mass global mental breakdown that it inspired. Because people think it's novel that 80-year-olds are dying at a high rate from flu. This tweet will age well." Newsflash, it really hasn't. I mean, this is, again, the president at a press conference last week.
Were you surprised when you saw these projections? The numbers are sobering.
They're very sobering. Yeah, when you see 100,000 people, that's at a minimum number. Now, what we're looking at, and as many people as we're talking about, whatever we can do under that number and substantially under that number, we've done that through really great mitigation. We've done that through a lot of very dedicated American people. That 100,000 is, according to modeling, a very low number. In fact, when I first saw the number, and I asked this a while ago, they said it's unlikely you'll be able to attain that. I think we're doing better than that. Now, I think we have to see, but I think we're doing better than that because, as John said, that would be, a lot of lives taking place over a relatively short period of time. But think of what would have happened if we didn't do anything. I mean, I've had many friends, business people with great, actually, common sense. They said, "Why don't we write it out?" A lot of people have said, a lot of people have thought about it. Write it out. Don't do anything. Just write it out and think of it as the flu. But it's not the flu. It's vicious. When you send a friend to the hospital and you call up to find out how is he doing, it happened to me, where he goes to the hospital, he says goodbye, he's sort of a tough guy, a little older, a little heavier than he'd like to be, frankly. And you call up the next day, how's he doing? And he's in a coma? This is not the flu. So we would have seen things had we done nothing. But for a long while, a lot of people were asking that question, I think, right? I was asking it also. I mean, a lot of people were saying, well, let's just ride it out. This is not to be ridden out, because then you would have been looking at potentially 2.2 million people or more. 2.2 million people in a relatively short period of time.
And it isn't just the elderly, as President Trump pointed out. As Bloomberg reported, many New York coronavirus patients are young, surprising doctors. And that news has been reflected everywhere. You see news like 1 in 5 hospitalizations are occurring in people under the age of 44. And globally, 10 to 15% of the moderate to severe cases have been people under 50. This disease mostly kills people who are elderly, but it doesn't spare people who are younger. And I mean, that can be obvious by just looking at the case of Boris Johnson, who said it spent 2 nights in the ICU. He's not in his 80s. The man is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, substantially younger than President Trump. This is not the flu. President Trump has said, this is not the flu. And yet, Candace Owens was flippantly saying that people thought it's novel that people were dying from a flu. You know, other people have been in the coronavirus minimizer camp. Dr. Drew, for example, and he recently just straight up apologized and withdrew his comments as a result of doing this. And yet Candace Owens hasn't. So it's kind of interesting to see that, like, most of the public and most of the people who were even in the camp of saying this wasn't a big deal have come around with seeing the statistics. Speaking of those, let's look at some of her predictions on the statistics, or her comparisons, rather. Back on February 27th, she said the following: let's do facts. 250,000 to 600,000 people per year die of the regular flu worldwide. 2,800 people have died of the coronavirus thus far this year. Now go put on your surgeon's mask while the rest of us ignore this quote-unquote epidemic. Remember, we talked about how she's kind of flippant about coronavirus? This continues. Let's go to March 13th. I know people hate how calm and rational I've been, but I really think we might survive this thing, guys. 85 million perished in World War II, 50 million perished from the Spanish flu, and we're about 4,000 deaths of coronavirus. The death toll predictions I'm seeing are irresponsible. Man, just ridiculous to say that a lot of people would die. Just ridiculous. 87,000 are dead so far today. That's just 4 weeks, less than 4 weeks. I think 3 weeks after Owens made that prediction. And you can see recently she's been trying to hedge a little bit. You know, people have talked about the modelers or statisticians moving the goalposts. Well, there's been plenty of goalposts moving coming the other way, too. On March 31st, Candace tweeted, 3,000 people have died from coronavirus so far this year. Wait, hold on. I thought it was 4,000 2 weeks ago. I guess she's moved down to just the stats in America, which makes sense given these. 2019, 250,000 died from medical errors, 169,000 accidental deaths, 35,000 alcohol-related deaths, 80,000 flu. Yeah. And 300,000 from fat-induced heart disease. We need to extend the lockdown to December 31st. It's the only way. Never mind that nobody's really advocating that. Although, except, a few crazy libs maybe, but most people are not. The fact is, she's still doing these asinine comparison to things that are stable from year to year. And, voila, about a week later, since it's April 8th today, from March 31st, this is America's deaths, 425,000 cases and nearly 15,000 deaths. So that's 5 times. So that's doubled more than twice in the 8 days that she's talked about this, while she's giving context. And this is sort of a consistent problem where the minimizers look at the models and say, well, the modelers are moving the goalposts. Well, the modelers are accounting for uncertainty, generally speaking, and most people who are sophisticated aren't relying on saying this one model is perfectly accurate. That argument is a red herring. But what is true is that if you've made comparisons between flu statistics and coronavirus statistics in February and March, you kind of look silly now because the statistics really did grow exponentially. Like, let's just look at the United States. When she was first tweeting, February 27, 28, we hadn't even had a single death from coronavirus in the United States, and there had only been a few around the world. When she tweeted on March 10th that her tweet would age well about people dying from the flu, there were only, 30 deaths in the United States from coronavirus. At that point, there were only, 1,500 or so, 1,000 potential cases. What's today? Well, now, as we saw, it's almost 15,000. 2,000 more people died today with almost 400,000 infected. More than that. Holy cow. So we've had a huge number of new cases, a huge number of deaths since Candace Owens made these flippant predictions comparing it to the flu. We've seen that it doesn't just affect the elderly, that it affects younger people too, that it puts a lot of people in the hospital and does serious damage. And yet, all the way go back again, Candace Owens is talking about how she's being fearless and everyone else is a coward, including, apparently, President Trump, for taking this seriously and for thinking this is a big deal. So what is Candace Owens getting at, though? Well, we can kind of see that from this tweet. She says, these have been my exact feelings watching the coronavirus pandemic play out. We've now arrived at the point where doctors and politicians are openly admitting to fluffing the death count. Still, the fans continue watching. So apparently, this is the objection based on this revelation from Birx that we're overcounting COVID-19 deaths. But really, it looks like, in fact, we're probably undercounting them. As New York Times reports, there's a problem where people who doctors suspect have died of coronavirus aren't able to get tests for them to ensure that that's accurately counted. For example, giving an anecdote of a coroner in Indiana wanting to know if coronavirus had killed a man in early March, but her health department denied her a test. And there are other reasons to suspect that globally we've had undercounting of deaths. J.D. Vance had a wonderful thread on this topic, talking about how the CDC guidelines don't require a test to confirm a case and have this comorbidity question. But he points out this is true for every disease. Not every flu death is counted as a flu death or as a confirmed flu test. And miscounting goes both ways. A really good point about how there's really good reason to think we're actually undercounting deaths, because in nearly every major European country that's happened, but also the fact that, the statistic you can really look at is kind of all-cause mortality. In New York City, normally 20 to 25 people per day die at home. And Mark Levine argues that it's almost more than 200. You're seeing a lot more people dying at home, just unable to get to the hospital, be diagnosed with anything. And that's true across the world. In Italy, as The Economist reports in an article titled COVID-19's Death Toll Appears Higher Than Official Figures Suggest, you see stats like this, where, and this is a really important graph to understand. It says deaths per 100,000 people per week in selected regions. The gray represents the sort of average normal number of deaths that you'd see in this region. And the red is the ones that are confirmed deaths. But this pink number here, this is deaths that are excess of the year average that aren't confirmed COVID-19, but we have reason to suspect are in fact COVID-19 because, the number of deaths is pretty consistent on a yearly basis. So there's reason to suspect that, especially in a place like Bergamo, where he had a massive number of people dying, both who are diagnosed with COVID and just dying in their homes, that you were undercounting it. There's another good graph here talking about how in Spain we saw it starting in mid-March, this massive spike in overall mortality. And some of that was the expected deaths, but some of that was unexplained, right? A good chunk of these deaths, the increased all-cause mortality count, is underexplained. And this is another from the Vance thread talking about what's happening in New York and New York's weekly mortality. You'll notice here you've got confirmed coronavirus deaths, and here the sort of all-cause mortality that year to year is very consistent and then spikes this year as a result of coronavirus. So the idea that we're overcounting it seems unlikely. And the idea that this isn't a serious epidemic that's causing a large amount of death in a really fast time frame, these sort of stats just kind of prove that that's wrong. And finally, there's one really good point also that Vance makes. Most people who die of a respiratory illness aren't totally healthy people. And that's true. And I think the key thing to keep in mind is, there are a lot of people with those comorbidities. Something like half the population has hypertension. Another half has some heart issues. There's a huge amount of diabetes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that still doesn't mean that those are people that would die from a normal flu. The flu really does stick to killing people who are above the age of 80. Coronavirus doesn't discriminate in that way. There are plenty of young people, not young, but plenty of middle-aged people who are dying from coronavirus. And as we saw before, a huge number of young to middle-aged people that are being hospitalized for it and doing serious damage. So, to kind of sum up, Candace Owens should stop being flippant about coronavirus, frankly. It's enough. This is not being fearless, or this is not everyone else, including President Trump, being a coward. This is just you being shameless and stubborn and being unwilling to admit that you got it wrong, that you've been getting it wrong for over a month, and grasping at straws to try and find some way to say that your flippant comparisons of coronavirus to the flu were somehow accurate. They're not. And it's really obnoxious. Candace Owens has a massive platform. There's a certain amount of responsibility that should come with having a platform of a couple million people, and it seems like she's just immune to the idea that she has any. President Trump has recognized that this is an unbelievably serious disease, that it's a plague, that it's not like the flu. And yet Candace Owens continues to claim that, her original tweets age well, that she's been right on the money the whole time. Absolute, utter nonsense. Candace Owens should knock this stuff up and stop being flippant about coronavirus. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, reminder, hit that subscribe button on youtube.com/humanevents. We're getting started, and we want your support. The more of you who subscribe, the better we do, and the more our voice gets out there. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll talk to you soon.